Mark chapter 7 verses 1 to 8, 14 to 15, and 21 to 23. The Father willed to give us birth by the word of truth, that we may be a kind of first fruits of his creatures. When the Pharisees with some scribes who had come from Jerusalem gathered around Jesus, they observed that some of his disciples ate their meals with unclean, that is, unwashed hands. For the Pharisees, and in fact, all Jews, do not eat without carefully washing their hands, keeping the tradition of the elders. And on coming from the marketplace, they do not eat without purifying themselves. And there are many other things that they have traditionally observed, the purification of cups and jugs and kettles and beds. So, the Pharisees and scribes questioned him, "Why do your disciples not follow the tradition of the elders, but instead eat a meal with unclean hands?" He responded, "Well did Isaiah prophesy about you hypocrites, as it is written, 'This people honors me with their lips, their hearts are far from me, in vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines human precepts.' You disregard God's commandment, but cling to human tradition." He summoned the crowd again, and said to them, "Hear me, all of you, and understand. Nothing that enters one from outside can defile that person, but the things that come out from within are what defile. From within people, from their hearts, come evil thoughts, unchastity, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, licentiousness, envy, blasphemy, arrogance, folly. All these evils come from within, and they defile." The religious leaders were sent from Jerusalem to investigate, and if possible, find fault with Jesus. The Pharisees had elevated their laws to the same status as God's law. Jesus scolded them for keeping their law and the tradition, in order to look holy, instead of honoring God. The hand-washing ritual was the man-made law. Mark carefully explains, "For the Pharisees, and all the Jews, do not eat unless they wash their hands, observing the traditions of the elders." Why did Mark so carefully explain these traditions? Remember, Mark is writing to a Gentile, a Roman, audience who would not have known about, or understood the hand-washing ritual. Originally, for the Jews, the law meant observing two things. It meant, first and foremost observing the 10 Commandments of God, and second, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, called the Torah, or Pentateuch. There was another law called the oral law. It is also called the tradition of the elders. These oral traditions, these rules and regulations, were not written down until long after the time of Jesus. It wasn't until the 3rd century AD, that the summary of these rules and regulations were written down, and they became known as the Mishnah. There were definite and rigid rules for washing of hands. Hand washing was not in the interests of hygienic purity, it was viewed as a spiritual or ceremonial cleansing, a tradition which demonstrated holiness. Before every meal, and between each of the courses of the meal, the hands had to be washed, and they had to be washed in a certain way. To fail to follow this ritual was, in Jewish eyes, not to be guilty of bad manners, not guilty in the health sense, but to be unclean in the sight of God. The man who ate with unclean hands, was subject to the attacks of an illness demon. To the Pharisaic and scribal Jew, religion was the following of God's laws, and man-made rules. Ritual and ceremonial regulations like hand-washing were considered to be evidence of being of service to God. Moral religion was buried under a mass of taboos and rules. Jesus had no use for all these regulations, thus they considered him to be an evil person. There is a fundamental separation between a man who sees religion in legalistic terms and the man who sees religion as honoring a loving God, and loving his fellow men. One seeks to control, and the other is a humble giver. As we can see from Jeremiah chapter 17 verses 9 to 10, what comes out of the heart is most important. The heart is deceitful above all things, and desperately corrupt, who can understand it? I the Lord search the mind, and try the heart, to give to every man according to his ways, according to the fruit of his doing. The Pharisees are hypocrites for 2 reasons. First, their actions are merely external, a show of piety, rather than coming from the heart, and secondly, their teaching of traditions are not God's law, and thus are not of equal value. There are 3 signs of a hypocrite: when he speaks lies, when he makes a promise he breaks it, and when he is trusted he betrays his trust. Author, unknown.